For part 2 of Esther, we're in chapter 3. So you're going to want to have that open if you have a Bible. Esther chapter 3. Have you ever seen one of the posters that says, "No knives, better lives"? I think there might be one at Valley Park, actually. You ever seen those? I saw one recently. It's the name of a charity that works in Scotland to try and stop young people carrying weapons. When I saw this poster, it got me thinking a little bit about why there are so many, mainly young guys, that live around kind of areas like Gracemount, who when they leave their house to go out for the day, they pick up like their keys and their phone, and then like a blade. Why is that? And I think it might be because there's a whole bunch of kids who go about with this constant feeling of danger, and so carrying a knife gives them this illusion of sort of safety. These young guys who are fearful of death, and so carrying a knife makes them think they have some sort of protection. Often these guys live under this constant sort of paranoia that there's someone out to get them. And that's the way they live. Esther chapter 3 is going to tell us that there is an enemy, and he desperately wants to kill you. And this is an enemy who a knife, no matter how big, is not going to do you any good against. And this chapter is going to push all of us to face up to the reality that there is a death sentence that hangs over us as we come into this world. That's where we're going. Now, if you mind, last week I said that we're going to meet at some point this character who's like the pantomime villain of the story of Esther. Now, the theme I've just kind of outlined for you doesn't feel very pantomime, does it? It doesn't feel very ha-ha. But we are going to meet this character. It's a dark start to the story last week that leads to a darker continuation this week. But we do meet this pantomime villain. He's a character called Haman. And Haman, we're told in chapter 3, plays the role in this story of enemy of God's people. He represents in the story the enemy of God's people, Satan. And so if you're kind of new to church, or if this is your first time in church, I don't think there's any, maybe one or two first timers. Some of the stuff this morning or this afternoon might sound a little bit weird. And some of it, especially as Andy said, on a really nice sunny day, is going to feel as far from reality as it could possibly be. But the Bible teaches that not only is there a very real and a very personal God, there is also a real and a personal enemy. It's the devil. And so when we talk about this stuff today, we're not in the realm of fantasy, and we're not in the realm of psychology, like some sort of boogeyman who lives in your wardrobe or under your bed. We're talking about an enemy who is very real. And we need to be aware we're talking about an enemy who is very near. He's real and he's personal. Now, if we think back to last week, we thought about the challenge of living as God's people in the kingdom of the world. This week we're going to think about what it's like to live as God's people with an enemy who desperately wants to kill you. That's the thing. And so Drew's going to come and read in just a minute. He's got an American accent. The story sounds better than an American accent. So Drew's going to come and read. What I want you to do, though, as he reads for us, is listen and try and take in as many of the details as you can. Listen to the story unfolding, but see this sort of shadow of Satan that is cast over chapter 3. All right? Chapter 2 ended with Mordecai saving the king's life, and so we would expect maybe we're going to read about Mordecai's reward. So here's chapter 3. Please look at it.
I don't believe, Tim, that it sounds better, but I'll give it my best go. Esther 3. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne with all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of King Xerxes. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast poor before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who charge of the king's business, that they may put into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Xerxes, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day, the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. When Mordecai learned all that he had done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them in sackcloth and ashes.
Now it seems like Mordecai's faithfulness from last week's been pretty forgotten about, doesn't it? As we start chapter 3. It's not him that gets the promotion. Instead, we find this other guy called Haman being promoted to become basically like the king's prime minister of this kingdom of the world. And his rise to power turns out to be really, really bad news for God's people. Because while all these other people in the kingdom are bowing down and giving respect to this new prime minister, Mordecai, for some reason, doesn't. He decides instead to do what we could call a Vashti, if you were here last week. He resists. He refuses. And all these other servants, they tried to get Mordecai to play his role, but he refuses again and again. And the reason for his dissent is sort of hinted at in verse 4. He was a Jew. Now Haman, we find, is disproportionately raging. Everyone else is bowing down at his feet. One guy won't. And he is filled with rage. Being part of God's people, all of a sudden, we find in this chapter, puts a target on your back. And that's as true today as it was back in this kingdom of Media and Persia. Sometimes I think we imagine the life of being a Christian as being a life that is carefree, where the sun always shines, like today, where everything smells of roses and everyone sort of likes us, and where nothing ever goes wrong. Sometimes that's the way we imagine the Christian life should be. But I want to say this morning that, or this afternoon, I'm going to have to get that right, this afternoon, that if we are to endure as Christians, and if we're going to live faithfully and fearlessly, then we have to be realistic that there is a dangerous enemy who wants to destroy you. We have to be realistic. There's a dangerous enemy who wants to destroy you. Now, the background to this very quickly escalating conflict goes a whole lot further back than we might think. And it goes a whole lot deeper too. This is an enemy from way, way, way back. Now, Mordecai, it says, is a Jew. We knew that from last week. He's part of God's people. Haman, on the other hand, verse 1 tells us, is an Agagite. He's a descendant of this guy called King Agag, who's the king of a tribe called the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites were an ancient enemy of the Jewish people. When we go back in history and we see 4 centuries of slavery that God's people endured in Egypt, as they exited from slavery in Egypt and travelled a really hard journey through the desert, this tribe called the Amalekites came and attacked them when they were at their weakest, when they were vulnerable, when they had just been delivered from slavery, when they were tired, and when they had been weakened. The Amalekites took their opportunity to attack. Now, God gave the Jews victory in this battle, but he declared on that day, from generation to generation, the Amalekites will be enemies of his people. Now, you fast forward a few hundred years, and here we find Haman, an Amalekite, preparing to attack God's people who have been defeated as Jerusalem was destroyed, exiled as the people were carried away, exploited as we saw last week, and scattered. They're weak. And if we're part of God's people today, we must be realistic about the fact that this is very often how this enemy acts. He attacks us when we're weak. When you're at your weakest, when you're at the end of a really long day, or at the end of a wearying season of life, here comes this little voice that says, you deserve better than this. It breeds bitterness, and it makes us envious and discontented. Or when we're suffering from illness and we're experiencing pain day after day after day, you're tempted to complain against God and wish that you had somebody else's life. It could be when we're grieving and we're tempted to doubt whether God is good at all. It could be when we're craving and we're tempted to go and find that thing that we used to worship as a god and use. It could be when we're depressed and we're tempted to despair. It could be when we've sinned and then we're tempted to think God could never love a sinner like me. It could be when we're away on holiday and out of good routines. It could be when we're plagued by memories and trauma from our past. It might just be when we're hungry and the sermon's going on a little bit too long. It could be when we're at our weakest. It's often when he strikes. This is his MO, if you like. And so don't be naive. There is an enemy. He is right there in those moments when you're at your weakest. Be realistic. You need to be realistic that is when he attacks. He is from way back and he's been doing this for many, many years. It's not just an old enemy, he's also an enemy who's filled with hate. Look at verse 6. He desperately wants blood. He's filled with rage. One person in this empire defies him, and what does he want to do? Wipe out an entire people group. Revenge on this one is not enough for him. He is so filled with hate for this one, he wants to annihilate them all. And it couldn't be much stronger in its description, could it? Verse 13. In order to destroy and to kill and to annihilate all of the Jews. Now, it is actually a little bit comical when you read it like that, isn't it? But this is a dark picture. He is filled with hatred. He's even willing, we find, to part with his own cash in order to get the king's approval to go and wipe out all these people. He is bloodthirsty. And Satan himself has a deep and a furious hatred of God's people, which comes and stems from his fierce and controlling hatred of God. Ever since the beginning of time, he has wanted to destroy the people that God made in his own image because they mirrored him. He hates him, and so he hates his people. And his hatred towards us fills him. There isn't any room for compassion or mercy or love. Hatred fills him. This is the enemy we face. And we are really naive if we think that he can be dismissed lightly. There is another episode in this long-running history of conflict between the Amalekites and the Jews. The first king of the Jews was called Saul. And Saul was told by God to wipe out completely, to destroy, to take out any trace of the Amalekites. God said, I'll give you victory. And so Saul went against the Amalekites in battle, and he defeated them. But he then felt strong as the victor. And instead of utterly removing these people from the face of the earth, he kept the best of their stuff, and he kept the best of their people, meaning their king, whose name was Agag. He didn't do what God said. He was disobedient. He keeps what he wants. He does what he thinks is better. And it proves to be really, really costly for Saul. This is the beginning of the end for him. He's going to lose his throne, really as a result of this disobedience. But here in Esther, we have Mordecai, who chapter 2, verse 5 tells us was a descendant of Kish, who was Saul's dad, facing off now against Haman, a descendant of Agag. This enemy only exists because Mordecai's ancestor thought he was strong enough to do things his own way. Now we can only speculate about why Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. I'll give you what I think. I don't think it's because Mordecai is so devoted to God that he would not bow down to anything else. I don't think it's that. Because Mordecai seems to be quite happy to go along with the rest of this world kingdom's ways. I don't think it's that. It seems more likely to me that the conflict between him and Haman, between the Jews and the Amalekites, was a mutual conflict. He knew that Haman was an enemy. Even worse than that, this enemy has just got his promotion. Bowing down in this culture was a sign of respect. I think this is Mordecai saying, I do not respect you. It was defiant. Maybe he felt secure because he's just saved the king's life. Maybe he felt like he was in a good position to take a stand. But his reaction to Haman's plan at the start of chapter 4, it seems to me like he wasn't expecting this kind of backlash. He was devastated. It comes back fiercer than he was expecting. And so we've got to be realistic today about the fact that the enemy is active not only when we're at our weakest, but also in those times when we feel strong. When we think that we have maybe defeated some particular sin in our lives, we grow complacent and lazy. We stop guarding against that sin. And what happens? Subtly and slowly, it grows again like these descendants of Agag. Back it comes. Maybe when we hit a milestone of being sober, that little voice whispers in our ear, you've done really well. Treat yourself to a little drink. You deserve it. It might be when we are kind of doing everything we know we're supposed to do, attending every meeting, reading our Bibles every day, serving in church, welcoming others into our home, preaching the sermon, leading the music, and that aggressive pride swells up within us. And a little voice says, you know, you're actually all right. You're pretty decent. You deserve a promotion, actually. You should be recognized. Maybe off the back of a community fun day when there's a bit of a buzz about the scheme. Maybe off the back of a week-long mission trip when you feel high and refreshed. Maybe off the back of a Sunday service where we've been fed and we've enjoyed fellowship. When we feel ourselves to be strong, very often in those moments we find that the enemy's fury is stronger. He's an enemy from way, way back who is filled with hate. And we need to be realistic about the fact too that he's an enemy who's devious. The king agrees to the extermination of these people on the basis of what? Verse 8. Haman says, these people stand out like a sore thumb. They don't toe the line. They do whatever they want. Actually, they fitted in just fine, didn't they? The king's been living with one of them for several years and has no idea about it. The enemy is a liar. He has always been a liar. He tempted the very first people way back at the start of time with the lie that God is not good and God is keeping back blessing from you. He tells the same lie today. He might even tell you that the lie that fitting in and assimilating into the words and not looking different at all is the way to stay safe. Only to then find that an undistinct Christian life where nobody knows is the very thing that makes you fruitless and joyless and lifeless. He's a liar. He's an ancient, hate-filled liar. And we've got to be realistic today that he desperately wants to destroy us. Now, this isn't the end of the story, and thankfully this isn't the only character in the story. Even though his attacks are very real, there are hints in this chapter that he's not free to do whatever he pleases. Look at verse 7. Lots are cast to determine this day when all this killing's going to get done. He wants to find the lucky day for a slaughter. So it's like rolling dice. They want to see what fate is going to say. But into the lap the lot is cast, says another part of the Bible in Proverbs chapter 16. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Haman's thinking, we'll let the fates decide. In reality, God appointed the day. It was no surprise. It was God who appointed the day. And the enemy, as we read at the very start of the service, is a roaring lion. But he is also a roaring lion on a leash. He isn't free to go about wherever he pleases, doing whatever he pleases. One of the very first stories in the second half of the Bible, in the New Testament, tells us about this enemy unleashing all of his furious attacks onto Jesus when he was in the wilderness. Now, he had just been baptized, caused to feel strong. But he'd also been in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. He was hungry, he was tired, he was weak. And along comes this enemy 3 times. He tempts him, trying to convince him to serve himself, trying to convince him to test his father, trying to convince him to receive all the splendor of the world in exchange for bowing down at his feet. Jesus stood. He refused to bow. Think about this. I thought about this week. Jesus endured from the devil even more violent and to a greater extent temptation than any one of us ever has or ever will, than any person who ever lived, because he never gave in. There was a fullness of temptation that came to Jesus, and he stood. He refused to bow. He overcame. And so even though being part of his people will mean that attacks will come, we have in Jesus a Saviour and a King and a friend who has overcome. Jesus doesn't leave us alone. And because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those when tempted too. He cares. And though the devil may be near, he is nearer. He's there. Satan's a dangerous enemy, but he's a defeated enemy. Undeniably, though, we finish Esther chapter 3, and the picture looks pretty bleak. Things are kind of in crisis mode. The clock's ticking. There is death coming. And I want to speak to you today, especially if you're here and Jesus isn't the love of your life. I want to speak to you if you're here and your whole life isn't about following him. If your heart isn't given to him completely. I want to show you from Esther chapter 3 that there is a need not only to be realistic about the enemy, but a need to be urgent. Because there's a death sentence that hangs over us as human beings. Be urgent. It's a death sentence we find in this chapter that our disobedience deserves. It stands in contrast to the order of King Xerxes in this chapter. King Xerxes orders this annihilation of God's people on the basis of a lie. But the death that comes to all of us comes because of very real sin that we've done. We cannot deny we are sinners. The Bible says the wages of sin is death. That's what's deserved by all of us. Jesus said, if you have looked at someone with anger, you're guilty of their murder. Jesus said, if you have looked with lust at someone who isn't your spouse, you've committed adultery with them in your heart. All of us have lied, have we not? Most of us have stolen. Remember. Most of us have stolen. Most of us have wanted something that someone else has. Most of us have worshipped ourselves or something else. Most of us have used God's name as a swear word. Kids, most of us haven't obeyed our parents. None of us have loved God as we ought to have loved him. We are undeniably sinners. And as a result, all of us deserve death. It's also a death sentence, though, that can't be undone. If you think back to last week, we saw that these laws that the king passed, they could never be repealed. These were uncancelable laws. And so you might be here today and thinking, fair enough, I'm a sinner. Fair enough. I've never claimed to be perfect. I know that I'm not. But you always bang on about how God is full of love. And surely if God is full of love, then he can just put away my sins. Surely if God is full of love, then he can forget about what I've done and he can forget about the consequences. But then God wouldn't be fair. And God wouldn't be just. What would you think of a judge who just let everybody off who came into his courtroom? Corrupt, right? Bent. God isn't like that. And if he did that, he wouldn't be holy. And if he wasn't holy, he wouldn't be worthy of our worship. And so it's not what he does. Our sin means there has to be death. It can't be any other way. And this is a death sentence from which there are no exceptions. If you look at verse 13, it tells us that this sentence that was passed applied to all of the Jews. Young and old, it says, men, women, and children. These were people born into this people under this sentence. And the death that's due for sin is required of everyone who's born into the human race. It's not just like a dime a dozen politician like Haman that we've upset. This is the one true and living God who we have offended. This is the one we ought to worship, who we have lived against. We're sinful by nature, but we're also sinful by experience. We know we have done it, and therefore we deserve this irreversible sentence of death. And maybe as I say that, you find yourself a little bit like the city of Susa at the end of chapter 3, bewildered, not knowing what to do, saying, well, in that case, what can I do? What must I do to be saved from that sentence of death? Or maybe you feel just hopeless, and then it's just despair, and you feel like joining Mordecai in mourning and weeping loudly because of your helplessness. That might not be a bad place to be. To cry. But where is God? Here's the truth. The God that this world rejected came into this world to save you. Jesus came. He was born as a human being so that he, though he is the undying God, might face this sentence of death in your place. This is how much he loves you. He came to suffer in order to save you who have offended him. He came to offer himself as a substitute for you because there had to be death. Without him, the right thing to do is to join in the wailing and the weeping and the mourning. But he offers himself to you. As the one who has satisfied justice, he offers himself to you as the only way to be saved. And some of us in this room maybe need to get off the fence. Because when we're on the fence, we are dangerously close to falling into that death that we deserve. And some of us need to recognize there is absolutely no other defense for that rightful judgment that we deserve. A knife will not help you one bit. Living a good life cannot compensate for our sin. Being someone who just keeps their head down won't make us slip under the radar. There are no exceptions. The wages of sin is death. But here's the good part. The free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. The clock's ticking. There is a sense of urgency to this message. There is an urgency to this passage. Boys and girls, some of you are in the service. Don't wait until you're older to ask Jesus to save you. And everybody here, for all of us, whoever you are, do not put off till tomorrow what you desperately need today. Throw yourself on his mercy. Ask him to save you. There is an urgency to this message. He's the only one who can save you. Now we leave Esther on a dark cliffhanger. But the Lord determined the day. And the day that he's determined, because he's kind, is not right now. And because he's kind, there's a warning of what's coming. And because he's kind, there is time to be saved. Now we're going to see what happens in Esther again next week. But don't put off what must be done. You might not reach next week.